The mansion stood tall, bathed in the golden glow of the late afternoon sun. It was the kind of house most people only dreamed of: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork worth more than an average person's lifetime earnings. Inside, a man sat in his leather chair, fingers tapping on the wooden desk. His sharp eyes studied the security camera feed on his laptop. He had made millions through hard work and smart decisions. But there was one thing he never trusted easily: people. Mr. Alexander Wright wasn't just a millionaire. He was a man who had seen the best and worst of human nature. Wealth had brought him comfort, but it had also introduced him to deception. He had been betrayed before, by business partners, by so-called friends, and even by someone he once considered family. That was why, despite his luxurious lifestyle, he always remained cautious. And now he had a new reason to be suspicious. A week ago, his longtime housekeeper had to leave suddenly due to a family emergency. In her place, a new maid had been hired, Emma. She was young, quiet, and polite, but something about her made Mr. Wright uneasy. She had no previous experience working for the wealthy, yet she carried herself with an air of grace. Her references checked out, but he couldn't shake off the feeling that there was something more to her. It wasn't that she had done anything wrong, at least not yet. But Mr. Wright had learned that trust was a dangerous thing to give away freely. And so he decided to test her. That afternoon, while Emma was busy in the kitchen, he walked into his study. The grand wooden safe stood against the wall, its heavy door slightly ajar. Inside, stacks of cash, valuable documents, and a few rare artifacts sat in plain sight. Normally, he would never leave it open, but today was different. Today, he wanted to see if his new maid was truly as honest as she appeared. He positioned a small hidden camera in the corner of the room, making sure it had a clear view of the safe. It was discreet, barely noticeable, but powerful enough to capture every movement, every hesitation, every flicker of temptation that might cross Emma's face. He then adjusted the settings on his laptop, ensuring he could watch the live feed from anywhere in the house. With everything in place, he took a deep breath. It wasn't just about the money. It was about knowing who he could trust. Minutes later, Emma's soft footsteps echoed down the hallway. She wasn't expecting him to be watching, wasn't expecting that this was a test. She carried a small duster in her hands, moving with a quiet efficiency of someone used to cleaning without drawing attention to herself. As she stepped into the study, she paused. Her eyes landed on the safe. Mr. Wright leaned forward, his heartbeat quickening slightly. This was the moment. Would she walk away? Would she take a quick peek? Would she reach for the cash? Emma stood still for a moment, then slowly took a step closer. Her fingers tightened around the duster. Her head tilted slightly, as if debating something in her mind. Mr. Wright watched her every move, his eyes narrowing. This was it. The truth about Emma would reveal itself in the next few seconds. But then something happened that he did not expect. Emma suddenly turned her head sharply, as if sensing something unseen. Her eyes scanned the room, not in the way a guilty person might, but in the way someone who felt watched would. She stood there, perfectly still, her expression unreadable. And then, as if she had made a decision, she turned away from the safe entirely and walked to the bookshelf instead, dusting it carefully, her hands steady. She never looked back at the open safe again. Mr. Wright exhaled, feeling a mix of emotions. Relief? Suspicion? Admiration? He wasn't sure. But one thing was certain: Emma was not as easy to read as he had assumed. Still watching the screen, he frowned. Had he been wrong about her? Or was she just careful? One thing was certain: this test wasn't over yet. And little did he know, Emma had her own secrets too. Secrets that, if revealed, could change everything. Mr. Wright shut his laptop slowly, his fingers drumming against the desk. He had watched every second of Emma's time in the study, but he still didn't know what to make of her. She hadn't stolen anything. She hadn't even looked at the safe for too long. And yet there was something in the way she had stopped, the way she had scanned the room, as if she knew something wasn't right. Had she sensed the camera? That would be odd. He had hidden it well. Or maybe she was just overly cautious. Someone who had nothing to hide wouldn't have reacted like that. The way she had stood still for those few seconds, the way her grip tightened on the duster, it was like she was debating something inside her own mind. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe, just maybe, Emma was exactly who she appeared to be, an honest woman trying to do her job. But years of wealth had made him paranoid, and he couldn't afford to ignore his instincts now. He needed to know more. Meanwhile, Emma finished her work for the day, moving through the house with her usual quiet efficiency. She never spoke unless spoken to, never lingered where she wasn't needed. She seemed to fade into the background, a presence that was always there but never intrusive. But inside, her mind was anything but quiet. She had seen the safe the moment she stepped into the study. It was impossible to miss. And the way it had been left open, carelessly, almost invitingly, felt wrong. It wasn't like Mr. Wright to be careless. From what she had gathered, he was meticulous about security. There were cameras around the house, locked doors, a controlled environment where nothing happened by accident. So why had the safe been left open today? Emma had forced herself to act normal, to ignore the money and valuables in plain sight. She had known she was being watched. She could feel it. Years of experience had taught her how to sense things like that. Because Emma wasn't just a maid. She had taken this job for a reason, and it wasn't for the paycheck. That night, as she lay in the small guest quarters Mr. Wright had provided, she pulled out an old photograph from her bag. The edges were worn, the ink slightly faded, but the faces were still clear. A woman smiling brightly, and a young girl standing beside her. Her mother and herself. Emma traced a finger over the photo, her jaw tightening. Mr. Wright had no idea who she really was. And he certainly didn't know that he was the reason her mother had lost everything. 15 years ago, her mother had worked for him, too, back when he wasn't a millionaire. Back when he was just an ambitious businessman building his empire. She had been his housekeeper, his most trusted employee, until something happened. Something that had ruined their lives. Her mother had been accused of theft. A watch, expensive and rare, had gone missing. Mr. Wright had been certain it was her. He hadn't listened to her pleas, hadn't given her a chance to prove her innocence. Instead, he had fired her without hesitation, dragging her name through the mud. No one else had hired her after that. The shame had followed them everywhere. Emma had grown up watching her mother struggle, working multiple jobs just to survive, all because of a crime she hadn't committed. And now fate had brought Emma back to the same house. She hadn't planned to steal anything. No, she wanted something far more valuable than money. She wanted the truth. She wanted to prove that her mother had never been a thief. And to do that, she needed to find out what really happened all those years ago. Mr. Wright had tested her today, but he wasn't the only one playing a game. The next morning, she continued her duties as usual. She dusted, cleaned, and kept to herself. Mr. Wright watched her closely, though he pretended not to. He was still uncertain about her, still waiting for something to confirm his suspicions. Then something unexpected happened. Emma was in the library, wiping down the shelves, when she noticed an old wooden box tucked away behind a row of books. It was covered in dust, forgotten. Curious, she pulled it out, coughing slightly as the dust stirred into the air. She opened the lid and froze. Inside was a collection of small, forgotten items, old letters, a pair of cufflinks, and at the very bottom, a watch. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the watch, the one her mother had been accused of stealing. For a moment, Emma just stared. It had been here, in this house, all along. Her hands clenched into fists. Her mother had been telling the truth. She had been innocent. Emma knew what she had to do. But just as she was about to take the watch, a shadow fell across the room. She looked up and locked eyes with Mr. Wright. The air between them grew thick with unspoken words. He had seen her holding the watch. And in that moment he knew Emma was here for a reason. A reason that had nothing to do with being a maid. Mr. Wright's sharp eyes locked onto Emma, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with tension, an unspoken challenge hanging in the silence. He took a slow step forward, his gaze dropping to the watch in her trembling hands. That watch, his voice was low, controlled, but there was something behind it, something unreadable. Emma's fingers curled around the watch protectively, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure what to say. "I didn't steal it," she finally said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "But you already know that, don't you?" Mr. Wright exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. He walked over to the desk, slowly, deliberately, and sat down. He studied her as if seeing her for the first time. "Who are you really?" he asked. Emma hesitated. She had come this far. There was no turning back now. "My mother worked for you," she said, watching his reaction carefully. 15 years ago, you accused her of stealing this watch. Fired her, ruined her life. Something flickered across his face, just for a second. Surprise, guilt, recognition. Emma couldn't tell. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. "Your mother's name?" "Sophia Carter." That name seemed to strike something in him. He looked away for a moment, his fingers tapping against the desk. Then after a long pause, he let out a slow breath. "I remember her." Emma's nails dug into her palm. She had spent years waiting to hear those words. Mr. Wright's gaze dropped to the watch again, and a bitter smile ghosted across his lips. "And now you think what? That I set her up? That I did it on purpose?" Emma's jaw tightened. "Didn't you?" He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "No, but I did make a mistake." Emma wasn't sure what to believe, but she kept listening as he leaned forward, his fingers steepled together. "That watch didn't go missing because of theft. It was misplaced by me." His voice was calm, but there was something in it that sounded like regret. "I remember that day now. I thought someone had taken it, and I let my suspicion get the better of me. Your mother swore she was innocent, but I was so sure, so blinded by my own paranoia that I didn't listen." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. All these years, her mother had suffered for nothing. Mr. Wright sighed. "When I found the watch later, it was too late. I had already fired her. And he hesitated. I convinced myself it was easier to let it go than to admit I was wrong." Emma swallowed hard. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to shout at him, to demand why he had let her mother suffer in silence. But at the same time, she saw something in his face she hadn't expected. Regret. "I can't change what happened," he continued, looking her in the eye. "But I can admit that I was wrong. And if your mother is still—" He hesitated, then reworded carefully. "If she's still here, I'd like to apologize." Emma felt a sharp pain in her chest. She passed away last year. Something shifted in his expression, an emotion Emma couldn't quite place. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mr. Wright exhaled. "I'm sorry," he said, and this time she could hear the weight behind it. "For what I did to her, for what I did to you." Emma didn't know what she had expected from this confrontation, but a part of her had wanted to see him deny it, to make excuses. Instead, he admitted it. She let out a shaky breath, looking down at the watch in her hands. "It's too late for her to hear your apology." "I know," he said quietly, "but maybe it's not too late for me to make it right in other ways." Emma met his gaze, searching for any sign of deception. But for the first time since she had entered this house, she didn't see a ruthless millionaire. She saw a man who had made mistakes. She placed the watch down on his desk. "She never wanted your money. She just wanted the truth." Mr. Wright nodded slowly. "And now she has it." The weight that had sat on Emma's chest for years felt a little lighter. It wasn't a perfect ending. It wouldn't bring her mother back. But it was something. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. With one last look at the house that had once been a symbol of injustice, Emma turned and walked away. And this time she was walking toward peace.